Imagine being burned alive, exiled forever, or having your entire family dishonored, all because you were accused of being too feminine by Viking standards. Picture a society so obsessed with masculine honor that they had a specific word, ergi, that could literally destroy your life overnight. This wasn't just name-calling. This was a death sentence wrapped in social humiliation that could follow you to your grave and beyond. The Vikings didn't just value masculinity. They weaponized it into a system of terror that would make modern bullies look like kindergarten playground disputes. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about Viking society and reveal a dark truth that historians have been reluctant to fully explore. Hit that subscribe button right now, because what comes next will blow your mind about how far the Vikings would go to punish men who didn't fit their brutal definition of manhood. In the brutal world of Viking society, there existed a single word so devastating that it could instantly transform a respected warrior into a social outcast worthy of death: ergi. This Old Norse term, roughly translating to unmanliness or effeminacy, represented far more than a simple insult. It was a legal and social weapon that could obliterate a man's entire existence within Viking culture. The concept of ergi was so deeply embedded in Norse society that it appears repeatedly in their sagas, laws, and historical records, revealing a civilization that had weaponized masculinity to an extent that would shock modern audiences. The legal implications of being labeled with ergi were catastrophic and immediate. Under Viking law, a man accused of ergi lost his legal standing as a full citizen, meaning he could no longer participate in the thing, the local assembly, own property in his own right, or even testify in legal proceedings. This legal death was often followed by actual death, as the accused became fair game for anyone seeking to restore their own honor by eliminating someone deemed unworthy of masculine respect. The Vikings had essentially created a legal framework where perceived femininity in men was treated as a crime against the natural order. The accusation of ergi could be triggered by behaviors that modern society would consider completely normal or even admirable. Men who showed too much interest in traditionally feminine activities like weaving, cooking elaborate meals, or taking excessive care with their appearance risked being branded with this deadly label. Even showing what the Vikings considered inappropriate emotional responses, such as crying openly over losses, expressing fear too readily in battle, or demonstrating excessive gentleness, could result in accusations that would destroy a man's social standing forever. The sexual implications of ergi were particularly complex and revealing of Viking attitudes toward masculinity and power. The Vikings made a crucial distinction between the active and passive roles in male sexual relationships, with the passive partner being the one subject to accusations of ergi. This wasn't necessarily about homosexuality as we understand it today, but rather about perceived submission and dominance. A man who was seen as taking the woman's role in any context, sexual, social, or political, risked being branded as ergi regardless of his actual sexual preferences or behaviors. The social mechanics of ergi accusations reveal how Viking society used fear of femininity to maintain rigid hierarchical structures and ensure compliance with masculine ideals. Men policed each other's behavior constantly, knowing that their own masculine status could be enhanced by successfully identifying and punishing those who failed to meet the community's standards. This created an atmosphere of perpetual surveillance where every gesture, word, and action was scrutinized for signs of insufficient masculinity. The historical sources that document ergi accusations show that this wasn't a rare or exceptional occurrence, but rather a regular feature of Viking social life. The Icelandic sagas, our most detailed sources for understanding Viking culture, are filled with examples of men whose lives were destroyed by accusations of unmanliness. These stories weren't presented as cautionary tales or criticisms of the system, but as normal examples of how Viking society maintained order and honor. The international implications of ergi extended beyond individual communities, as Viking raiders and traders carried these rigid masculine expectations with them throughout their travels. Foreign men who interacted with Vikings learned quickly that any behavior perceived as feminine could result in immediate violence or social rejection. This cultural export of weaponized masculinity influenced other societies, and contributed to the spread of similar attitudes throughout medieval Europe, creating a legacy of masculine enforcement that would persist for centuries beyond the Viking Age itself. The Viking definition of acceptable masculine behavior was so narrow and unforgiving that men who displayed even basic human kindness or emotional vulnerability faced immediate social death and often physical violence. Historical records from the Viking Age reveal countless examples of men whose lives were destroyed not for committing actual crimes, but for failing to demonstrate sufficient brutality, aggression, and emotional hardness in their daily interactions. This systematic punishment of gentleness created a society where compassion became a luxury that men literally could not afford. Archaeological evidence from Viking burial sites supports the written historical accounts of how severely gentle men were punished in Norse society. Graves of men who were likely victims of orgy accusations often show signs of violent deaths, social exclusion from normal burial practices, and deliberate desecration of their remains. These archaeological findings suggest that the punishment for perceived femininity extended even beyond death, with the community taking steps to ensure that unmanly men could not find peace in the afterlife, according to Viking religious beliefs. The economic consequences of being labeled as too gentle were devastating and immediate, as Viking society operated on complex networks of mutual obligation and trust that depended entirely on one's masculine reputation. Men accused of excessive gentleness found themselves excluded from trading partnerships, raiding expeditions, and agricultural cooperatives that formed the backbone of Viking economic life. Without these essential economic relationships, gentle men faced poverty, starvation, and complete dependence on the charity of others, charity that was rarely forthcoming for those branded as unmanly. The impact on families when a man was accused of excessive gentleness reveals the far-reaching consequences of Viking masculine enforcement. Wives of men labeled as ergi often faced social ostracism themselves, with their own reputations damaged by association with an unmanly husband. Children suffered even more severely, as they inherited their father's shame and found themselves excluded from normal social relationships, marriage prospects, and economic opportunities. Entire family lines could be destroyed by a single accusation of gentleness against the male head of household. The religious dimensions of gentleness accusations in Viking society were particularly cruel, as Norse mythology and religious practices explicitly celebrated violence and aggression, while portraying gentleness as a betrayal of divine masculine ideals. The Viking gods themselves were depicted as warriors who solved problems through violence and showed no mercy to enemies, creating a religious framework that justified and even demanded the punishment of gentle men. Priests and religious leaders actively participated in identifying and condemning men whose behavior was deemed insufficiently aggressive. The psychological effects of living in a society where gentleness was literally life-threatening created widespread mental health issues among Viking men, though these were not recognized or addressed by their culture. Historical accounts suggest that many Viking men developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, depression, and other psychological conditions, as they struggled to suppress their natural human emotions and empathy in order to survive. The constant fear of being perceived as too gentle forced men to adopt increasingly extreme behaviors to prove their masculinity. The international reputation of Vikings as merciless warriors was directly connected to their systematic elimination of gentle men from their society. By creating a culture where only the most aggressive and emotionally hardened men could survive and prosper, Viking communities essentially bred themselves into becoming the terrifying raiders and conquerors that other cultures learned to fear. This artificial selection for masculine aggression had profound effects on Viking military effectiveness, but at an enormous human cost that included the destruction of countless lives and the creation of a society where basic human decency became a fatal weakness. The long-term consequences of punishing gentleness extended far beyond the Viking Age itself, influencing medieval European concepts of masculinity and creating cultural patterns that persisted for centuries after Viking civilization had ended. Viking society developed elaborate and systematically cruel rituals designed to publicly humiliate men accused of insufficient masculinity, creating spectacles of degradation that served both as punishment for the accused and as terrifying warnings to other men who might be tempted to stray from rigid masculine norms. These rituals were not spontaneous outbursts of violence, but carefully orchestrated ceremonies that involved entire communities and were designed to maximize psychological trauma while reinforcing social hierarchies through displays of masculine dominance and feminine subjugation. The most documented and horrifying of these rituals was called nid, a practice that involved forcing accused men to perform symbolic acts of feminine submission while the community watched and participated in their degradation. Historical sources describe men being forced to dress in women's clothing, perform traditionally feminine tasks under public scrutiny, and endure sexual humiliation that was designed to permanently mark them as unworthy of masculine respect. These ceremonies could last for days or even weeks, with the community treating them as festivals that combined entertainment with social enforcement. The psychological sophistication of these humiliation rituals reveals that Vikings understood exactly how to destroy a man's sense of self and social identity through carefully applied shame and degradation. The rituals were designed to attack every aspect of masculine identity simultaneously: physical strength, sexual dominance, social status, and emotional control, leaving victims completely broken and unable to function in Viking society. Survivors of these rituals often became permanent outcasts who wandered between communities, serving as living examples of what happened to men who failed to meet masculine expectations. The participation of women in these masculine humiliation rituals adds another layer of cruelty and complexity to the practice, as Viking society specifically required women to take active roles in degrading accused men. Women were expected to mock, physically abuse, and sexually humiliate the victims, creating a twisted dynamic where feminine participation became essential to masculine punishment. This forced female participation served multiple purposes. It reinforced women's subordinate status by requiring them to participate in violence. It demonstrated masculine power over both accused men and women, and it created maximum psychological impact by having the punishment delivered by those the men were accused of resembling. The legal framework surrounding these humiliation rituals was extensive and detailed, with specific procedures that had to be followed for the punishment to be considered legitimate under Viking law. Communities that failed to properly conduct these rituals faced legal consequences themselves, while individuals who refused to participate could find themselves accused of the same crimes as the original victims. This legal structure ensured that the rituals became self-perpetuating systems of community-wide violence that were extremely difficult for individuals to resist or escape. The geographic spread of these humiliation practices throughout Viking territories reveals how central masculine enforcement was to Viking cultural identity, as similar rituals have been documented everywhere Vikings settled or raided. From Iceland to Russia, from Ireland to the Byzantine Empire, Viking communities carried these practices with them and imposed them on local populations, spreading their particular brand of weaponized masculinity throughout the medieval world. Local populations learned to adopt similar practices to avoid being targeted themselves. The seasonal timing of many humiliation rituals coincided with important Viking festivals and religious celebrations, transforming what should have been joyous community gatherings into displays of masculine violence and social control. The integration of these cruel practices into religious and cultural celebrations reveals how deeply embedded masculine enforcement was in Viking worldview, making it virtually impossible for individuals or communities to question or resist without facing accusations themselves. The technological innovations that Vikings developed specifically for conducting these rituals demonstrate the time, energy, and resources that their society devoted to masculine enforcement, including specialized tools for inflicting humiliation and degradation that served no other purpose than to destroy men who failed to meet impossible masculine standards. Viking communities operated sophisticated surveillance systems designed to monitor every aspect of male behavior, creating an atmosphere of constant fear where men knew they were being watched and judged for signs of insufficient masculinity at all times. This surveillance wasn't conducted by formal authorities or professional enforcers, but by every member of the community who understood that their own social status could be enhanced by successfully identifying and reporting men who failed to meet masculine expectations. The result was a society where privacy became virtually impossible for men and where every gesture, word, and expression was subject to immediate scrutiny and potential punishment. The methods used to police male behavior were remarkably thorough and invasive, involving everything from monitoring men's sleeping arrangements and eating habits to observing their interactions with children and animals. Community members were expected to report any behavior that suggested a man might be developing feminine tendencies, including taking too much time with personal grooming, showing excessive affection toward family members, or displaying what the Vikings considered inappropriate emotional responses to various situations. This constant monitoring created a culture of informants where trust between men became virtually impossible. The enforcement mechanisms for masculine behavior violations were swift, brutal, and designed to escalate quickly from social pressure to physical violence. Men who were reported for suspicious behavior faced immediate confrontation from other community members, who were expected to challenge the accused directly and demand explanations for their conduct. These confrontations often became public spectacles that served as both punishment for the accused and entertainment for observers, with the community treating masculine enforcement as a form of social drama that reinforced their shared values. The role of violence in policing masculine behavior went far beyond simple punishment, as Vikings understood that the threat of physical harm was essential to maintaining their rigid masculine hierarchy. Men who failed initial challenges faced increasingly severe consequences, including beatings, public humiliation, property destruction, and ultimately exile or death. The escalation was predictable and systematic, giving accused men multiple opportunities to witness what awaited them if they failed to conform to masculine expectations. The economic incentives that drove masculine behavior policing reveal how deeply integrated these practices were into Viking social and economic structures. Men who successfully identified and punished masculine violations could claim property, slaves, and social status from their victims, while those who failed to participate in enforcement faced suspicion themselves. This created a self-reinforcing system where economic survival depended on active participation in the oppression of other men, making resistance extremely difficult and costly. The psychological impact of living under constant masculine surveillance created widespread paranoia and anxiety among Viking men, who understood that their survival depended on maintaining an impossible standard of masculine performance at all times. Historical sources suggest that many men developed obsessive behaviors around proving their masculinity, engaging in increasingly extreme acts of violence and aggression to demonstrate their worthiness to remain in the community. This constant performance of masculinity became exhausting and psychologically devastating for many men. The international implications of Viking masculine policing extended their influence far beyond their own communities, as foreign traders, diplomats, and captives learned quickly that survival in Viking territory required understanding and conforming to their masculine expectations. This cultural export created ripple effects throughout medieval Europe, where other societies began adopting similar practices to avoid being perceived as weak by their Viking neighbors. The Viking reputation for masculine enforcement became so widespread that it influenced diplomatic relationships and trade negotiations throughout the medieval world. The technological and logistical innovations that Vikings developed specifically for masculine behavior policing demonstrate the enormous resources their society devoted to this practice, including specialized weapons, restraint devices, and architectural features designed to facilitate public humiliation and punishment of men who failed to meet their impossible standards of masculine behavior. When Viking communities decided that a man's violations of masculine norms were too severe to be corrected through humiliation or physical punishment, they implemented a series of ultimate penalties designed not only to destroy the individual, but to eliminate his entire bloodline from Viking society forever. These extreme punishments represented the most terrifying aspect of Viking masculine enforcement, as they demonstrated the civilization's willingness to sacrifice entire families and genetic lines to maintain their rigid definition of acceptable manhood. The implementation of these ultimate punishments was systematic, thorough, and designed to ensure that no trace of the accused man's existence would survive to contaminate future generations. The practice of bloodline elimination began with the formal declaration of nid against not just the accused man but his entire family line, including parents, siblings, children, and even distant relatives who shared his blood. This declaration effectively erased the family from Viking legal and social existence, making them non-persons who had no rights, protections, or claims to property or status within the community. The legal death of an entire bloodline was considered more severe than physical death, as it meant that the family's name, achievements, and legacy would be completely forgotten, and their souls would find no rest in the Viking and afterlife. The systematic destruction of family property and possessions that accompanied bloodline elimination was conducted with ritualistic thoroughness, as Viking communities understood that eliminating all material traces of the accused family was essential to completely erasing their existence. Houses were burned with ceremonial significance, livestock were slaughtered or distributed to community members, and even personal items like clothing and weapons were destroyed or given away to ensure that nothing remained to remind the community of the disgraced family's former existence. The forced exile or execution of family members followed specific patterns designed to maximize the psychological impact on both the victims and the community that witnessed their destruction. Children of accused men were often sold into slavery or abandoned in wilderness areas where they would likely die, while wives and daughters faced sexual violence and social degradation before being driven from the community. Elderly parents and relatives were typically left to die of exposure or starvation, as no community member was allowed to provide them with assistance without risking accusations themselves. The religious dimensions of bloodline destruction involved complex rituals designed to ensure that the souls of destroyed families would be denied entry to Valhalla and other honored afterlife destinations in Viking mythology. These spiritual punishments were considered as important as the physical destruction, as Vikings believed that allowing disgraced men and their families to achieve honored deaths would contaminate the afterlife realm and anger the gods who demanded masculine purity from their followers. The documentation and remembrance practices surrounding bloodline elimination were carefully designed to ensure that the destroyed families would never be forgotten by the community, but would be remembered only as examples of what happened to those who violated masculine norms. Skaldic poetry, carved runestones, and oral traditions were all employed to preserve the stories of destroyed bloodlines as cautionary tales that would terrorize future generations of Viking men into compliance with masculine expectations. The international consequences of bloodline elimination extended Viking influence throughout the medieval world, as foreign communities learned that violating Viking masculine norms could result not just in individual punishment, but in the complete destruction of entire families and communities. This reputation for extreme collective punishment made Viking threats particularly effective in diplomatic and military contexts, as enemies understood that resistance could result in genocidal retaliation against their populations. The long-term genetic and cultural impact of systematically eliminating bloodlines that produced men who failed to meet masculine standards had profound effects on Viking society itself, essentially breeding their population for extreme masculine traits while eliminating genetic and cultural diversity that might have produced different approaches to manhood and social organization. The systematic masculine enforcement practices developed by Viking society didn't disappear when their civilization ended. Instead, they spread throughout medieval Europe and became foundational elements of Western masculine culture that continue to influence modern society in ways that most people never recognize or understand. The Viking legacy of weaponized masculinity created cultural patterns that have persisted for over 1,000 years, shaping how Western societies define manhood, police male behavior, and punish men who fail to conform to rigid masculine expectations. This terrifying inheritance continues to destroy lives and limit human potential in the modern world. The medieval adoption of Viking masculine enforcement practices by European nobility and religious institutions ensured that these brutal standards would be codified into law, religious doctrine, and social custom throughout the Western world. Medieval knights adopted Viking concepts of masculine honor and developed elaborate codes of chivalry that maintained many of the same deadly expectations for male behavior, while Christian institutions incorporated Viking attitudes toward masculine dominance into religious teachings about proper male roles and behavior. The result was a comprehensive cultural system that made Viking masculine enforcement appear natural and divinely ordained. The colonial expansion of European powers carried these Viking-influenced concepts of masculinity to every continent, imposing Western definitions of manhood on indigenous populations and creating global systems of masculine enforcement that destroyed traditional gender roles and social structures worldwide. Indigenous cultures that had developed more flexible or egalitarian approaches to masculinity found themselves forced to adopt European masculine standards or face systematic violence and cultural destruction. This global export of Viking masculine culture created international patterns of male dominance and gender violence that persist in the modern world. The Industrial Revolution intensified Viking-derived masculine enforcement by creating new economic and social contexts where masculine performance became essential to survival in increasingly competitive and hierarchical societies. Factory work, military service, and corporate employment all adopted masculine enforcement practices that directly descended from Viking social control mechanisms, creating modern institutions where men continue to face social and economic destruction for failing to meet impossible masculine standards. The result is a contemporary world where Viking attitudes toward masculinity remain embedded in workplace cultures, educational systems, and social expectations. The psychological impact of living in societies built on Viking masculine principles has created epidemic levels of mental health problems among modern men, who continue to face the same impossible expectations and constant surveillance that terrorized their Viking ancestors. Contemporary suicide rates, violence statistics, and addiction patterns among men directly reflect the ongoing influence of cultural systems that punish male vulnerability and emotional expression while demanding constant performance of aggressive masculinity. Modern men are literally dying from cultural expectations that originated in Viking society over 1,000 years ago. The modern men's rights movements and toxic masculinity debates represent contemporary versions of the same conflicts that destroyed lives in Viking society, as men continue to struggle with cultural expectations that demand impossible levels of masculine performance, while providing no acceptable outlets for human vulnerability or emotional expression. Social media and digital communication have created new forms of masculine surveillance and punishment that mirror Viking community enforcement mechanisms, allowing for instant global humiliation of men who fail to meet masculine expectations. The terrifying truth is that we're still living in the shadow of Viking masculine culture, still destroying men who dare to be gentle, emotional, or vulnerable. Every time a man is mocked for crying, punished for showing weakness, or driven to violence to prove his manhood, we're witnessing the continuation of a 1,000-year-old system of cultural terror that began with the Vikings. If this shocking revelation about the brutal origins of modern masculinity opened your eyes to how these ancient practices still shape our world, smash that like button, subscribe for more hidden truths about how history continues to control our lives, and hit that notification bell, because understanding the past is the first step toward breaking free from its deadly grip on the present.